Good to see you all. So everyone knows this is the third of a four-part series. The first two parts were on American Indian art. The third part will be on American decorative arts. And then the last part will be on American painting and sculpture, okay? We don't have a handout for you today because our curators are still working on revising it. Stefanie Knapp is just really immersed in 30 Americans right now, and she's short a person, so we're talking maybe perhaps by April, perhaps, and we'll send that out as soon as it's revised, okay? So today we're hearing from Stefanie Dlugosz, which is Polish. Dlugosz-Acton. I've never seen a Polish name like that. And she'll be speaking again on the decorative arts in the American collection. And here she has two breaks for us. So without further ado, Stefanie. And if we could switch over the PowerPoints.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for being here today. Yes, I put in some natural breaks. The way that I have the training set up is kind of through the galleries. So we're going to start with our earliest American galleries in decorative arts, 210, 211, and then we're going to go into 213 through 15, and then 217 and beyond. So our natural progression. Is that better? You got to tell me. I can't hear. So my goal is for all of you to be really comfortable discussing the decorative arts in the collection alongside other works. I know that sometimes they can be very easily forgotten, or because they're so familiar, can be kind of talked about in different ways and kind of a touchstone. So I think that that's a great way to capitalize on them. I am going to focus on two broader themes: style and technology. I think that those are topics that relate specifically to the works that I'm talking about, but also talk to broader themes in the galleries, and can transfer onto other works, including paintings and sculpture. I'm also going to provide contextual information, such as social and cultural factors, to help offer a more comprehensive understanding of the galleries, as well as these works and their production, their importance, why we have them here, and their creation. I want to make connections between these decorative arts and the other works so you can present a more fluid and cohesive tour for all of our visitors. So starting off, the Hooper Room. It is probably, if I do say so, the best colonial room in the country. We're fortunate to have a ton of information about it, as well as its owner. It was built in 1754. It was part of a country home for this gentleman right here, Robert King Hooper, in this fabulous, very formal portrait that's at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He was a wealthy merchant. He earned his fortune by exporting dried codfish to Europe, and was one of the most prosperous merchants in New England throughout his lifetime. He was married 4 times, and he fathered 11 children, so very busy gentleman. And he built a summer home in Danvers, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, and that's where the room that we have is from. It was known fondly as the Lindens because of the trees, the linden trees that lined its driveway. His primary residence was actually a mansion in the fishing port of Marblehead, but the fact that he had a country home was a status symbol, and it established him as a gentleman landowner and proclaimed his wealth while also showing his sphere of influence that it expanded not just in Marblehead but beyond. The Revolutionary War saw a decline in merchant revenues. Obviously, they weren't trading and shipping as much with England due to colonial boycotts. And to make matters worse for Hooper, he was also a Tory. So he sided on the wrong side of history at this point. And so being on the outbreak of Revolutionary War, he was actually very lucky. He escaped with his life. The home at one point in time was actually used for Tories to do their business in, which I think is really interesting. He kind of helped house some of the Revolutionary War generals. And he eventually did lose the house to creditors, having to mortgage many of his properties. But he was actually allowed to retain the use of this home throughout his lifetime. So he was so well respected in the community that even though he did not financially own any of his homes at this point, he was allowed to retain their use until he passed. And I think that that is something that you can see in this portrait, that he was presented as a successful businessman and sitting at his desk and working, and you can see the really beautiful penmanship. It's very plain that he was well-versed and educated. There's also a wonderful sparkle in his eye that I think up to some mischief. And with that background in mind, I want to shift into the style of the room. And before we dive in too deep, I want to preface with how we define styles, and that particularly in architecture and decorative arts, they can be a little tricky. Historically, they've been associated with European, mainly British monarchs, and I don't know about you, but I cannot list every single monarch historically, and they're given time and dates that they reigned. And so I think that the way that we present these should be a little bit more specific for our visitors. So additionally, as time progressed, many of these styles merged, so it's really hard to differentiate them between Georgian and Queen Anne and Victorian. Although you can kind of see some of those ebbs and flows, they merged often, making it really difficult to delineate. So for the Hooper Hall, this is apt, as the architecture of the room was created out of a newly developed style in the 18th century that was based on 16th century designs by Andrea Palladio, so the Palladian. And he outlined these theories in his 4 books of architecture, which were published in 1570. And this Palladian-style architecture spread rapidly in the mid to late 18th century, as it was favored by wealthy patrons as expressions of their rank and judgment. A prime example would be Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. And it's also important to note that this is a striking departure from earlier English decorative traditions. The inspiration for the style didn't just come from the writings and plans, but also traveling to see historical architectural sites. So wealthy colonists, similar to Europeans, might visit London or go on the Grand Tour. And the majority of American builders, particularly at this time, and during the Revolutionary War, and before it, relied heavily on English pattern books. So that didn't necessarily mean that all of these people were visiting any of these historical sites, but that they were seeing them and they were being disseminated widely through these pattern books for architectural as well as decorative inspiration. The halls modeled on English prints of parlors and drawing rooms from townhouses, and small country estates. Its design expressed Hooper's own interest in being up to date with very fashionable principles of the time, and employing these principles in the home identified him not only as a man of significant social standing, but also having considerable taste, that he was with the times and the new taste. As you may know, the room was reduced in size to fit in a gallery when it first came to the museum, and this compromised its classical symmetry because it's actually a square. And it was returned to its original square shape, restoring this fabulous glory of the measurements of 21 by 21 feet square. And it's really vital to know that if you look in, you'll see all of these kind of characteristics. You can see theories of order, symmetry, and proportion drawn from these classical motifs. So if we look at these 18th century pattern books, you can see that it was a golden age of illustrating architecture and furniture design. So about 250 different architectural titles and about 40 different furniture titles perpetuated and were published at this time as a principal means of transmitting these plans nationally and internationally. They were the reason for pleasing proportions and quality consideration that characterized this style of architecture and furniture wherever it was produced. So there's kind of a fluid and consistency nationally and internationally. Prints were sent to the colonies and served as examples for master craftsmen who built the finest homes. And some of the books and prints that were mostly aesthetically pleasing featured eye-catching engravings of buildings. There was a book of architecture by James Gibbs that was produced in 1728, or Abraham Swan's The British Architect in 1745, but they provided practical advice for building and decorating in the latest styles. Rather than copying directly, most colonial artisans used these books as kind of guides to reference and extracted details to achieve unique compositions. So they would take a flourish from here, they would take a column from here, and they would put them into their own kind of puzzle of sorts. And you can see in the details the drawing from the 4 architectures. We have this kind of little flourish here that gets a little bit bigger here that is a predominant feature here. So it's still there, but different things are emphasized at different times. And you can definitely see the transmission. So thanks to an IMLS grant, in-depth scientific analysis also revealed that the hall was originally painted this robin's egg blue, which is why it's that color. And it was also an oil-based paint, which was typical of the times. And it makes a really beautiful contrast with this reddish-brown paneling floor work. The paint, that you can see in these images and also when you go in the room, has this really high glass varnish. It's very shiny. And sometimes when I go in and I'm like, oh, it's so shiny. Why is it so shiny? It's because that the rooms historically would have been really poorly lit. We're talking, mid-18th century, candles, fireplace, and only sunlight. So the varnish would have made it so that light would have reflected more fluidly throughout the room to make it brighter in appearance. The hall functioned as a multi-use space. It fit the needs for a variety of occasions. So it could have had business or letter writing, hence the desk. It could have been used for entertaining and dancing or reading by the fire. Its original furnishings would have been somewhat sparse, similar to the way that we present it, which is always a question that I receive. Why is there so little furniture in this space? Because it was a country home, and it also would have been used as this multi-purpose space. So if you have a lot of furniture and you have to move it often for different events, it doesn't necessarily coincide. So it would have been moved against the walls to open the space for a dance or entertainment. And when not hosting, Hooper probably would have sat at the secretary desk or sat by the fire and had a drink. None of the objects in this room belong to Hooper. I want to clarify that. But it's furnished today with pieces similar to what he would have selected. So there are both American-made pieces and pieces imported from England because he was of such a stature that he would have been able to get silver candlesticks from London. Speaking of which, just outside the room is a recent acquisition from 2017, and it's something that was owned by one of Hooper's contemporaries, whom I'll discuss in just a second. This coffee pot is by the artist John Blowers, and it's an ambitious and impressive piece of early American silver. Few pieces of silver survive, as they could easily have been melted down and sold in times of hardship. It always breaks my heart whenever I see church silver up at auction, because it means that the church would have had to sell their silver, and it would have made it this far, that it wasn't melted down before. So little is known about Blowers' life and career as a silversmith. At this time, records were not, despite the fact that we know so much about Hooper, silversmiths and makers at the time were not as well cataloged. This is the only coffee pot bearing his mark, and it holds the distinction of being the largest of the only 13 examples that we know by him in existence. So it's really incredible that not only do we know the maker, but we know how many pieces he did make and that it is marked by him. And you can see the mark on the opposite side. It's big enough, and I believe in another photo I will show it to you. So it's of important historical significance as it highlights this transformation in drinking habits. When coffee, tea, and chocolate arrived in 17th century Europe and colonial America, they were initially valued for their medicinal qualities, and they were soon considered a necessity of daily life, while their preparation, of course, invoked a need for more items to be able to prepare them. Another reason for the sudden necessity of coffee pots was that so that coffee could be consumed in the home. For a certain period of time, particularly in the UK, London, and surrounding areas in England, coffee shops and coffee houses were places that only men could go. They were seen as places of business and politics and lively discussions of trade, and that was not a place for sensible and good women to be seen. And so as coffee became more popular as a beverage, it was something that necessitated being drunk at home, not only for the gentlemen, but also the ladies. And so the redefinition of what a coffee pot was also kind of shifting. Coffee pots were designed specific to the home to be part of family life, and they were made for an eager and rising merchant class for private use. The function of this and all other silver coffee pots was not just to serve coffee, but also to highlight the wealth and status of the owners. Silver was a very showy material, it was expensive, and in the presence of candle and firelight, it could really sparkle and be a centerpiece in a room. The coffee pot's intricately carved coat of arms has details such as this really fabulous standing stag on the side, and then there is this stag that's the head of a stag on the crest of this helmet, and this really beautiful foliated scroll work. We know who this coat of arms belongs to. It belongs to John Jones, who was another prosperous merchant and ship owner with very large real estate holdings, and much like Robert Hooper. And Jones was married to Mary Ann Faneuil, who was the sister of Peter Faneuil, who built Faneuil Hall in Boston. And Faneuil Hall in Boston was often referred to as the home of free speech and the cradle of liberty. It hosted America's first town hall meeting, and so the hall's vital role in revolutionary politics wasn't really a part of the original plans. It was meant to be a market. And but like most histories, it's complicated because Peter Faneuil traded in many commodities, including sugar, molasses, wine, fish, timber, and slaves. And all of those trades and sales increased his wealth and prosperity, providing him the means to give Faneuil Hall to the city of Boston, and then also to have his sister marry another very wealthy merchant. So there is the mark. So coffee pots have been evolving since the 17th century. The earliest pouring vessels for coffee, tea, and chocolate were not actually widely differentiated. Up until this point, food and drink were rarely taken hot. So in addition to new needs for function, they also needed to withstand heat, hence the initial importation of porcelain from China as kind of the quick fix. Silversmiths emulated Chinese porcelain shapes as best they could and found ways to add insulators, which were usually wood or ivory handles, to avoid burns. Coffee pots derived from early cylindrical lighthouse forms. They were taller and more vertical than teapots. And then, of course, American silversmiths imitated these early English and continental forms. Coffee pots were specifically designed for the brewing of coffee, as coffee grounds are put into hot water, and unlike chocolate, they don't mix. So you have the coffee grounds at the bottom, so the flared bottom or the larger bottom was meant to kind of keep the grounds at bay. And then these sharp pour spouts were to trap the floating grounds that were left in the liquid. So this piece would have been made entirely by hand, beginning with hammering metal down to a disc. So you would have started with a chunk of metal, and then you would have hammered it down into a flat disc, and then raised using hammers, anvils, and stakes. The disc was stretched into a thinner piece, and then it was cupped into this vessel form. The spout, baluster drop, and finial. So the spout, the baluster drop, and the finial would all have been cast forms. And so sometimes when you see oversized spouts or handles, it's not because of a design, it's because molds were very expensive to make. And so you couldn't custom mold or custom make a spout or handle for every coffee pot. So silversmiths would have had a select number and would have just made them and kind of fit them on the coffee pots as best they could. There were also filters in at the spot to allow liquid to pass through. So this coffee pot has a really beautiful strainer that's right here in between the spout and the rest of the pot. So by the early 18th century, bolder designs and ornaments began to be implemented, and that's where we see the shift into using the curvilinear shapes. You get a little bit more into the Rococo and the works that you see in our Folgers coffee collection. The coffee pot also relates to these portraits by Copley, as well as the Benjamin West and the Gilbert Stuart, as these are all the types of men and women who would have owned such a grand object. Briefly, I also want to add how you can compare the Hooper Room as a portrait to someone's life and style, as well as the objects that he used, to Mr. and Mrs. John Barrett. The two portraits are just outside the door of the Hooper Room. And similar to the room, these portraits include carefully captured details that invite us into the world of the colonial elite. The Barretts were Boston Whigs who became ardent supporters of the American Revolution, so that's really beautiful bookends to kind of see a Tory versus I'm sorry. Rebel. Thank you. And Mr. John Barrett was a member of a committee that protested the British parliamentary taxation and supported banning all non-essential imports from Great Britain. Eventually supplying financial assistance to the revolutionary troops, Barrett was of a similar status to Hooper and probably owned a home and furnished it similarly to the Hooper Hall. And the stark contrast between Hooper and his life are fantastic bookends to call out to our visitors. Although we don't always think about it, regional design in colonial America was a significant catalyst, and immigration had a considerable impact as well. Skilled artisans from England and France arrived in the colonies, furnishing the wealthy and also training local artisans. Large trees were abundant in America, and cabinet makers who were able to work with large boards and incorporate the beauty of wood grain into their pieces, which was different working in England. Also, the American coastline was an important stop along trade routes from Africa, the Caribbean, the Atlantic coast up and down, and to the colonies, and then also onto England. And so American furniture makers had access to the finest and largest boards from their native forests, but also the choicest mahoganies and other types of wood. So they supplied the demand and increase for larger and more elaborate pieces that would display colonists' newly acquired affluence. Boston was the leading colonial city in the early 18th century and the first to implement aspects of new styles, blending several influences, including Baroque, classical, and Asian-inspired forms. By the 1750s, Philadelphia surpassed Boston as the largest colonial city. Immigrant artisans trained in the latest European methods in the years preceding the Revolution, and then artisans that catered to the loyalist sympathies of their patrons closely followed English forms due to their taste. The most original furniture was actually made in Newport, Rhode Island, where native-born cabinet makers, led by members of the Townsend and Goddard families, developed a distinct local style that had no known parallel in European furniture or contemporary pattern books. So it's really, really unique. And I wanted to show you this with examples from 3 areas. And although they are subtle, there are some very distinct differences between them. I encourage you to take a closer look the next time you go through the galleries. Look especially at the feet, particularly because at claw and ball feet, both the pieces on either side here have claw and ball feet. And they're really distinct because each region or city would render them slightly differently to denote the location of origin, almost like a signature. So one city might have 3 talons, and one might have 4. One might have very clearly delineated feathers on it, and one might not. The center card table by John Townsend differs from the other 2 with its pretty straight lines. These really beautiful kind of serpentine sides, it kind of goes in on the edge, on where the drawers are. And the drawers, and then these linen folds and motifs, these icicles, there's some icicles, and the linen fold motifs, are actually inlaid satin wood, so very high quality woodworking. John Townsend of Newport was one of the most talented of all of the 18th century American craftsmen. The seaport, second only to Boston among New England cities, was the center of a thriving furniture industry dominated by two intermarried Quaker families, the Townsends and the Goddards. And so among his peers, Townsend was unique in regularly signing and dating his finest works, which are characterized by a highly refined and elegant version of Newport's distinctive local furniture style. By the way, we have two card tables. One of them is signed, which is really exciting. Townsend's earliest pieces have beautifully proportioned and well-executed legs and claw and bow feet. In about 1765, he introduced a signature design to Newport, the block and shell. And in addition to this, for which he is best known, Townsend specialized in the manufacture of straight-legged tables, which is what we have. Beginning at about 1785, he crafted numerous tables with square, stout-fluted legs, mostly carved tables with folding tops and swing legs, as well as tables with drop leaves. So what you don't see is that the pair that we have are card tables. So one of these legs in the back, actually, correction, both of these legs in the back go like this, and then fold out like this, and then the table flips over. So when they're open, you only see what looks like three legs. And the tables are distinctive for their perfect proportions and precision of execution. And you can also see the very restrained influence of the Palladio style, and what I think that you can definitely see the classical influences with the folds and the very refined classical symmetry. Around 1794, Townsend began making tables in the neoclassical or federal style, featuring tapered legs inlaid with simple bellflower or carrot-shaped lightwood decoration. And a pair of tables in this style are here. By the late 18th century, sorry, one more thing before I move from Townsend. If you look very closely, and I know these are on small platforms, so please be careful, and when you point these out to our visitors, I know you guys are all on top of it, but you can see sand was used to heat and make the patterning. And so it would have been heated to make it brown, so that's what makes those folds and that inlay look like there's shadows on it. So it would have been hot sand poured on things to kind of create that. And that's something that most craftsmen working in marquetry would have been doing at the time. So by the late 18th century, Philadelphia, known for its broad streets, large brick and stone houses, and busy docks, was a thriving center of business, enterprise, and trade. It was also an important center for the finest American furniture. Cabinet makers created masterpieces in the Rococo style, derived from prints and designs imported from London pattern books, and many ambitious and talented London-trained artisans immigrated to Philadelphia, where they fulfilled the demand for this type of furniture in the most fashionable styles, but locally made with these English styles. So they would have been using, as I mentioned earlier, native boards and things from the U.S. The Philadelphia side table, which is on your far right, illustrates the finest regional craftsmanship, and is also an adaptation of English precedents. It also has a sophistication of it also shows the sophistication of the client, as the Italian marble top would have had to be imported, and you would have had to have certain influence and have of a certain class to be able to import Italian marble for your piece of furniture at the time. Additionally, traditional German design motifs continued to circulate into the Pennsylvania countryside. So there's a very big difference between coastal American furniture and middle, early northeastern furniture. I'm from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, so I can tell you all about Quaker furniture and Amish country, but there's a definite distinction. So I know it's still a little early, we don't have to actually break. But if you guys have questions about this first kind of early American section, I would be delighted to answer them. Yes.
I'm interested in the way the capitals were manufactured from the Hooper room. You showed the patterns and that kind of thing. What was a wooden pattern made, and then they cast from that wooden pattern?
They would have been okay. So the question was, how were these capitals for the Hooper room made? Were they cast? And how did you kind of get from a drawing to this three-dimensional piece within the room? So using pattern books, you would have had someone there would have been an architect involved who was drawing and taking these designs and translating them. This is actually a carved piece of wood. So if you go in there, it's not any more than 2 or 3 inches. And so it would have been a plank that would have been carved. And so to build up these pieces, you would have either, I don't think that they had the sophistication at this point to stack layer them, but they would have had a larger piece, a larger plank of wood or a thicker plank of wood, and would have been carving out of that. At this time, craftsmen were the ones that were also designing because they had to. So you would have had German and French cabinet makers coming over, trying to make their new life in America, and they would have been employed to do these things as well as making furniture.
So these would have each been individually carved?
Yes. Yes. When we think about the labor that goes into a piece of architecture or design or decorative arts, we're talking, at this time, there was some technology, but technology was very limited, and it was for only incredibly successful cabinet makers and designers and architects who, at this point in time, were not making the money to actually sustain that type of practice. So we're talking about a large group of individuals who were all working together. So it's not just one person, it's not just one individual, but they would have been carved, which is not actually that far off from most other, it's closer in history to the precedents that they were looking at than it is to kind of where we're at today. Yes?
Would there be crossover between the guy who carved the Capitol and, say, one of the furniture makers?
At this point in time, was there crossover between the individuals who were carving in architectural elements and furniture makers? At this point in time in the United States, because it was still such a growing community, even in these thriving cities, there was still this similar effect that happened in Europe with kind of the guild system and furniture makers and cabinet makers kind of living in the same quarters and things. And so there would have definitely been crossover. They were all looking at these pattern books, and they were all kind of having these conversations. And because at this point there wasn't necessarily one person working on one piece, a cabinet maker may or may not or someone working for one cabinet maker may or may not shift to work for another cabinet maker or an architect at the time, because you got work when you could take it. And so because of all of those skills were transferable, they were definitely in conversation. Yes, David?
You said the Hooper room is one of the best examples in America. What makes it so special?
What makes it so special, what makes the Hooper room so special and one of the best examples in America is that it is original. The room, which I apologize I did not mention, the room, we purchased it in 1933 directly out of the home. And we purchased it from a dealer. If you're familiar with early American furniture, Israel Sack. Many of our pieces in the collection were actually acquired through him. And we were the first and only institution to purchase a room of this size. And we basically took the entire room from its original location, scooped it out, put all of the panels on a train, and brought it out to Kansas City. So it's not pastiche. A lot of other rooms are kind of a hodgepodge of there's a contemporary panel or there's a modern panel. When, say, that it was being sold in the 1950s or 60s, a dealer was like, oh, this panel's missing. We'll just carve one that looks like it in the middle to make the room complete. Our room is actually complete. It is in what it would have looked like and how it would have existed in that space, which is why it was such a big deal when Catherine reinstalled it in 2009 and we received that IMLS grant to be able to get it back to its classical proportions, to get it back to that 21 by 21, because we always had the space. The house still exists. The Linden still exists. It does not exist in Massachusetts anymore. It actually was moved by a wealthy couple in the early 20th century to Washington, D.C., and the only room that is not original in their home is our room, because we bought it fair and square, and Mr. Sack was unable to sell the other rooms to other institutions. That was kind of his vision of, I'll sell a room here, and I'll sell one to Boston, and I'll sell one to Georgia, and I'll sell one to Dallas, and that never happened, and so he ended up selling the room to a couple. So they actually came, I think, or there was some crossover where they got the original plans to the house, which also still exist. We have copies of them in our curatorial files, and they replicated the room. So the room that's in their house is not original. Yes.
Is there a significance to the dimensions, the 21 by 21?
Not the 21 by 21, but the symmetry and the square are references that would have been taken from the Palladian style at the time. All the way in the back, sorry. What is the wood? I want to say it's pine. It was treated with a gesso, and then it was treated with the paint. And actually, that varnish it was an oil-based paint, and then I believe the varnish was from a linseed oil and lacquer kind of material, which is where the sheen came from. It does not come from the linden trees, no. All the way in the back, sorry.
So it seems to me that period piece rooms are not as popular in museums as they used to be. What's the broader trend here in museums with these period rooms?
I think the broader trend, the question was about the broader trend of not seeing kind of period piece rooms in museums anymore and in larger institutions. I think a lot of that has to do with audiences changing and taste changing. A bigger issue for me, and I'm sure many of you remember even 10 years ago, we had more period rooms on view here, that we now have this piece. A lot of it comes down to if we have a room that is this incredible in provenance, in history, we know its owner, we know that all of it is original, showing something that isn't of that same caliber and quality is very challenging. And because dealers in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s did their job very well, when our museum was being built, you know that we had a lot of money and not a lot of things. And so we were buying things to fill up space. And period rooms took up a lot of space and created a really fabulous experience. But through research, we have found that a lot of those rooms are not original. A lot of those rooms were cobbled together. Many of the elements were modern elements that were added on. And so it makes it a lot harder to want to show those spaces. I still maintain I love them. I think they're fabulous. They have a very special place in my heart. But when you go through other institutions and then you go to places like the Victoria and Albert in London and you experience period room after period room after period room where everything is original, everything that is being shown in the room was original to that space, it's very hard to kind of compete with those things. So it really comes down to kind of the research and how we approach these things. And also our room is, you have a very limited viewing of it. So it's not as experiential as it could be. But then, of course, you all know that we have the wonderful excitement and challenge of how do we get someone to experience something and kind of step out of their comfort zone and welcome them, while also making sure that we maintain the integrity of the object, that we maintain that it is an art object, and that people don't touch things or sit on things, which is a kind of that constant push and pull. Yes?
The mahogany furniture, did the wood come from the colonies or did it come from trees?
It could have, in mahogany, I think would have come from the Caribbean. Yes. Yes.
Is there any chance that they'll bring back the Oak Hall Library, Nelson's Library, that was used to be on display?
In our immediate plans, no. The period room that we would very much like to get back on view is the Turre in Gabinetto, if you remember that lovely withdrawing room. And so we've kind of been in conversation with that. And then there's other research for a potential, it has not been on view for a very long time, but the gold room, if anyone is familiar with the gold painted room, those are other things that were being researched, but not Nelson's Hall, no.
I have another question.
Mhm.
Could you speak to the floor that was brought in from, I understand, like a railroad station in Kansas or someplace that on the floor?
The floor is the floor for the Hooper room that was brought in. I don't actually know where it came from. I do know that it was picked because through research they found out that it was these kind of large pine planks that were untreated, and it was a contrast, that kind of brownish reddish contrast to the blue was original to the room, so they replicated that as best as they possibly could. So the floor is not original.
Somewhere I have that it came from a train station they were tearing down somewhere in Kansas.
I cannot confirm that for you right now. Okay. All right. Would we like to move on, or does anyone like? Okay. Perfect. Thank you. As we transition from the earlier galleries to the next, there is a major shift in style. And as you enter these galleries, you see this settee by Charles Bodin, and it's a really wonderful welcome scene. I love this piece. With this landscape by Genoux, it's a new painting, hanging above it, as if it's in a home. And I think that this is a really great moment to bring up that not all decorative artworks, architecture and design, were made for a domestic setting. And I think that's something that's really important because I think it's very easy for us to kind of fall into this, and it's very easy for our visitors to think, oh, there's a seat. I have something like that, or I have seen something like that, and not all of these pieces were made for that context. So World's Fairs arose with 1851 London making the first, and they generated national pride, competition. They exhibited international works that were the newest and the best, displayed progressive economic and technological ideas of each participating country. Objects and technologies displayed were then modified for domestic consumption. And as you may know, many of the works in our collection were shown at or are connected to World's Fairs. And the Herder bookcase is an excellent example of this centerpiece at 11 feet by almost 10 feet in size. Excuse me. So this is unlike all of the other works that I'm going to talk about today because it was never intended for domestic use. So seeing it kind of alongside all of these other pieces that would have been shown in a home is, I'm not going to say anachronistic, but it's to be noted. So it was designed to astonish people. It was constructed as a showpiece to capture the attention of visitors at the exhibition of the Industry of All Nations held in New York in 1853, and it was the first American international exposition. There was little to no concern for practicality or cost, and most of the objects were intricately constructed and laboriously carved. So this bookcase is, as you have seen in the galleries, gargantuan. The amount of people needed to carve it, as well as to put it together. Even today, I know that it traveled for the World's Fair exhibition that Catherine put together in 2012, and it took about 4 or 5 people to take it apart at any given point. So incredibly difficult to maneuver. Stylistically, the bookcase stands as one, if not the most ambitious examples of Gothic Revival furniture in the United States. It was strongly influenced by trends in Europe, reflecting the emerging cosmopolitan and affluent Americans who demanded goods like those that they saw when they traveled abroad or that they had seen at international fairs. It was carved from oak, but in a from American oak, excuse me, but it is very distinctly European in style, and its craftsmanship equals European quality. With the sheer mass of the bookcase, it demonstrates America's increasing presence as a world power, which at that point was meant to feel was meant to project. The Gothic Revival style recalls its European precedents, so it's kind of making a stand, but also reaching back to those precedents to say we're here and we're a part of the international standing. The upper case is decorated with architectural buttresses, arches, spires, and pinnacles resembling a Gothic church. However, their arrangement on the bookcase and its enormous scale function are not really medieval at all. Carving dominates the lower part of the case, and they're richly carved acorns and leaves, reflecting back on the American oak. And then there's also 4 18-inch tall figures, 2 female and 2 male, dressed in kind of quasi-medieval costumes, and they symbolize sculpture, painting, music, and architecture. So they're personifications of the arts. And I think these figures relate really nicely with the recent acquisition of the James Henry Hazeltine, America Triumphant. I know that Stefanie Knapp is going to discuss this more in depth with you next week, but I wanted to mention the similarities and the ties between the two artworks because I think that they just pair really beautifully. In a similar tone to Herder's overtly large and adorned cabinet, America Triumphant also celebrates the achievement and skill of the artist and his assistants. In the sculpture, marbles transformed into skin, drapery, hair, foliage, and feathers, similarly to the way that Herder's figures kind of transcend their oak material. The allegorical figure of the winged victory, who may represent hope for the national unity and reconciliation following the Civil War, recalls the same Greek revival return to classical ideas which swept the 19th century and which are seen mimicked in the 4 figures on the bottom of Herder's cabinet. Getting back to stylistic influences, the House Decorator and Painter's Guide of 1840 observed that, quote, "The present age is distinguished from all others in having no style which can properly be called its own," end quote. 19th century American architecture and furniture design were characterized by a parade of different styles that claimed inspiration from the past. Many revival styles were generated, including Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, Egyptian Revival, Rococo Revival, Renaissance Revival, Neo-Grec. All of them were widely disseminated through pattern books and journals that I talked about for the cabinet maker, builder, and general reader. And some of these revival styles were only found in furniture design, while others were used in architecture and interior design as well. And some of these revivals were ignited by the newfound interest in antiquarianism, I'm not going to say it again, while other revival styles, such as the Gothic, became linked to national identity. So the Gothic revival had apparent associations with the Middle Ages, yet in America, it instilled this European legitimacy of the young country's artistic heritage. So really trying to kind of stand the ground of saying, we're here, we're at the same level as you, even though we're a very new country. So, little brother syndrome. Embracing these styles, there was also a reaction to rapid urbanization, the spread of manufacturing and mechanization, and the massive influx of poor immigrants, and the Civil War. So as a result, wealthy members of American society embraced this kind of romanticism, the reigning philosophy of the day, which urged kind of a re-examination of the simple ways of the past to find happiness in a complicated present. The bookcase made such an impression during its presentation at the World's Fair that it was illustrated and discussed in publications around the exhibition. You can see a drawing of the piece here, which was included in The World of Science, Art, and Industry, illustrated from examples in the New York exhibition, 1853 to 54. That's the title of the book. The text accompanying the image states, "In the American department of the exhibition, we have been agreeably surprised to find some pieces of ornamental furniture of large size, which in design and elaborate and excellent artistry are entirely creditable to the exhibitors and compare on equal terms with the production of foreign manufacturers. It is true that many and perhaps all of these have been indebted to persons not American-born, but we may partly claim the talent which is naturalized among us." So similar to colonial furniture, the immigration of cabinet makers and ebonistes from Europe to America contributed to this quality of design and craftsmanship and construction of American furniture. So throughout the 19th century, the European influence on design was commonplace because international exhibitions created a forum for that display and a comparison for these objects from different countries, as well as the makers themselves being from an international spectrum. Gustav Herder himself arrived in the United States only a year or two before the exhibition. New York offered Gustav the opportunity to participate in a growing industry. He had already become a predominant cabinet maker in Germany in a short period, and he was freed from the restrictions of the European guild system, so he could do more in the United States. He also brought with him the latest fashions from Stuttgart, Germany, and upon arriving in the United States, Herder collaborated, and he was very smart. He paired up with a more established cabinet maker, Erastus Bulkley, for the bookcase's impressive design and skilled execution. By 1858, Herder actually bought Bulkley's share of the business and operated as the sole proprietor until 1864, when he made his brother Christian his partner and changed the name to Herder Brothers. And Gustav was active in the firm until his retirement in 1870. The Industrial Revolution also contributed and shaped the economic, social, and artistic developments of the 19th century in both Europe and America. This was a period of transition from manual to mechanical labor, which reached its midpoint around the turn of the century. The New York furniture industry was actually slow to mechanize with steam power before the early 1870s because of the lack of efficient steam engines and reliable boilers, and the fact that the city had no nearby cheap sources of power, such as waterfalls or rapids. Woodworking machinery was expensive to acquire, install, and run. And it wasn't always faster, which we think that machines are always faster. It was not actually that much faster than having an incredibly skilled woodworker at that time, or more accurate. So therefore, a supply of skilled workers was actually the industry's most important resource. In this slide, you can see some really delightful contemporary illustrations of hydraulics and machinery, mechanical technologies from around 1850 to provide some context for what type of machinery and technology was in use around this time. Sculptural carving was the hallmark of excellent cabinet making in the 1850s, but diminished in furniture during the 1860s and 70s. By that time, a new vocabulary of furniture came into favor, and it drew from contemporary French fashion during the reign of Napoleon III. In the decade after the Civil War, gilded incising, applied scrollwork, inset marquetry panes, and veneer were employed. So this kind of, the Herder and the hand-carved American oak was passé by that time in about, the period of 30 years. So subsequently, noteworthy cabinet makers were engaged in the business of interior decoration as well as furniture. So they were really smart to learn that they couldn't just do one thing and that they needed to be entrepreneurs of their own right. And coming from a European guild system, many of them tried to capitalize on that. And Herder was one of the first to develop his traditional role of the cabinet maker into creating interiors. So if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you will see several interiors by the Herder brothers, top to bottom. As we go into the next space, I want to briefly mention that this is a stellar moment to address what I consider to be beauty and decadence, which can very easily be dismissed today. The visual relationship between Frederick Edwin Church's frame for Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives and these fabulous pieces of cut glass are simply stunning. Church designed the frame and had it fabricated by his dealer. The ornate, highly reflective frame must have seemed so sumptuous and over the top in early artificial lighting when it was shown. It's a casata-type frame, which is a simple lap-jointed frame with decorative moldings derived from classical entablatures. And the casata frame derives from Italian Renaissance models, where the recessed friezes would have been relatively plain. However, Church filled it with a Molmach 10-pointed star pattern, which is a crucial iconographic element for his Middle Eastern subject. So the entablatures are this kind of substructure of molding. See, we can't get away from the classical architecture. It follows. Major elements of classical architecture that are commonly divided into the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice, and can be as decorative or as plain as the maker would like them to be. These series of nested recesses or coves create pockets of shadow that alternate with bright, projecting water-gilt bands of molding on Church's frame. And the resulting visual rhythm creates this momentum, leading the eye inward into the bigger picture. And I mention these as the cut glass patterning works in a really similar way to sparkle and dazzle. The solid, complex frame also makes for a pleasing contrast to the broad area of landscape. And I really just wanted to show you these similarities between this starburst kind of pattern and the stars that Church was using because they're just a really wonderful comparison. Both of them are painstakingly intricate, and they have that kind of same effect. Anytime I come into this room, you just can't stop. I just can't go in and not kind of stop and be in awe of the sparkle of the glass, and then you turn around and you have this beautifully sparkly frame. And so I think it's a really nice touchstone. So cut glass became an important American industry and was an immensely popular luxury good from about 1880 until 1915. Catching light and flashing with brilliance, the impressive examples on display are comprised of deeply carved and complicated patterns in one large work that is made of multiple pieces, and then in the other, which includes these really beautiful silver mounts. The extremely tall example is a testament to the technical and artistic ability of the manufacturer. It's comprised of 5 parts. The Quaker City Cut Glass Company was established in Philadelphia in 1902, and by 1904 they actually had one of the largest displays of cut glass, entirely lit by electric lights, at the St. Louis exposition, where the firm won a gold medal for a vase that was 67 inches tall. The silver-mounted vase has strong geometric or organic designs, such as the deeply cut hobstars, which I showed you on the previous slide, and fans that decorate the form. The simple yet elegant form of the sterling silver collar is accentuated with understated floral motifs, and it demonstrates the cooperation of a silver company with a glass manufacturer to produce exquisite works that would combine the hard and cold brilliance of glass with the warmth of silver. So thick lead glass blanks were blown and then decorated with these cuts, made by artisans using lathes with exacting precision and expertise to cut the sparkling pieces. The cutting is actually very sharp and very deep in order to be able to reflect light from these highly polished surfaces. And although the deep cut patterns were varied, they were usually geometric, including starbursts or rays, and those were the patterns that provided the greatest number of facets to create these kind of really dynamic, sparkling effects. From about 1876 until the start of World War I, American cut glass artisans excelled worldwide. And this was because several events dramatically improved the American cut glass industry, thus bringing this superiority about. Deposits of high-grade silica were discovered, and that led to vastly better glass-making formulas than those of their European counterparts. Natural gas replaced coal-fired furnaces, and then, of course, electricity replaced steam-driven cutting wheels. So these changes resulted in better control of the glass-making process, and at the same time, similar with the Herder cabinet, many of Europe's finest glassmakers and cutters were immigrating to this country finding ready markets, finding a very hungry, very affluent American audience. Cut glass became a symbol of elegance and leisure, and the demand for beautiful glass produced spurred intense competition and creativity within the industry, hence the fabulous pieces that we have. Early on, one individual would cut a single piece, so they would have different size wheels to make different size cuts. However, American assembly line methods were quickly adapted and able to have each cutter have one designated size wheel, and so a single piece was then passed from station to station, thus increasing productivity. Continuing onto another fabulous glass artwork, I want to discuss John Lafarge's Peonies Blowing in the Wind. And one of the things that's really crucial about this piece is that trade opened up in the 1850s with Japan and China. And these nations shaped design as never before. We are still dealing with these repercussions in design. You can kind of see as we go through my presentation, you'll see the lasting impact that this has had. During the second half of the 19th century, Japanese aesthetics profoundly influenced European and American artists and designers. It affected painting, sculpture, decorative arts, architecture, everything. No part of the decorative arts production was untouched by this influence. And it also detailed studies of nature, bold natural ornament, asymmetrical compositions, and this very kind of refined, clean aesthetic. The rage for all things Japanese permeated the European and American culture. Lafarge was among the first American artists to import and be influenced by Japanese color prints. He even made a trip to Japan in 1886. Likewise, Japanese manufacturers studied European tastes in order to produce goods for Europe and America's demand using new materials and employing Asian themes. So Japanese manufacturers would make Japanese-looking things for an American market that were based on the European idea of what the Japanese were making. So it's this very kind of strange cyclical thing. It was also at this time that the provocative and sensuous aesthetic movement threatened to dismantle fussy, overbearing, and conservative Victorian traditions. More than an art movement, aestheticism infiltrated all areas of life, from music and literature to interior design and fashion. It was at its core a desire to create art for art's sake and to exalt taste, the pursuit of beauty and self-expression, helping to set the stage for global 20th century modern art. So when I talk about aestheticism, I want you to think about Whistler, and I want you to think about the dandy and Dorian Gray. So if we're all drinking tea in our kimono and lounging with some beautiful flowers by our window in repose, that's kind of where we're at. So this window by Lafarge is based on Japanese hanging scrolls from the artist's own collection. The white, gold, and green floral border emulate the scroll's elaborate silk mountings, and you can also see yellow ties on top for the hanging of the scroll. And peonies embody Lafarge's creativity and his desire to fuse non-American and Asian motifs and aesthetic ideas into his work. And this is a really excellent link into the Hassam's The Sonata, which refers to Japanese art through its really flat decorative design, seen in the staccato brushwork that echoes the edges of the painting, and through its own Japanese hanging scroll in the background. And that shows a blossoming cherry tree against the really beautiful gold background, which is, of course, then emulated in the gold frame and on the beautiful yellow rose on top of the piano. The Japanese reverence for beauty was particularly appealing to followers of the aesthetic movement like Hassan. Blossoming cherry trees are a powerful cultural symbol in Japan, where they represent the cultivation of beauty for its own sake, as Japanese cherry trees do not bear any fruit. They just flower and blossom. Other paintings in the surrounding gallery also enforce these kind of cross-cultural influences. Lafarge also worked in a variety of other media throughout his career, namely painting. At the age of 24, after he studied law for some time, he went to Paris to study painting and returned to the United States in 1859. He painted flowers in oil during the 1860s, and he preferred to capture their essence rather than pursue scientific accuracy. So his watercolor compositions often contain bold jewel-like colors, and we're lucky to have 2 works on paper by Lafarge in the museum's collections that you see here. The exquisite watercolor florals that he painted in the 1880s recall his earlier oils, but their rich color speaks to his mastery of the medium, and it also reflects to his later experiments in stained glass, so it's this really wonderful kind of transition. He often used watercolor to develop sketches for his murals and stained glass compositions, which I think is really wonderful. And he often produced paintings in plein air or outdoors, which contributed to their spontaneous brushwork. An astute critic remarked, quote, "His flowers have no botanical truth, but are burning with love and beauty," end quote. So Lafarge was one of the first artists to incorporate opalescent glass into stained glass. His windows were unprecedented. The vibrantly colored stained glass achieves these really wonderful illusionistic effects of painting, but with luminosity and richness of color unattainable with oil paint. Here you can see some details. Hues of red and pink meld together to create the peony's glowing petals. They are opaque and more translucent pieces, adding to the movement of the composition. There are deep greens and golden yellows, which suggest these sun-dappled leaves. And the lines of lead convey a kinship with the outlines in Japanese prints. Lafarge developed a 3-dimensional quality through the inclusion of opalescent glass, a multicolored iridescent glass. For this, he gained an international reputation and contributed to the revival of the art of stained glass. We know as you go through our galleries that stained glass was not a new technology in any way, but the way that he was using glass and the type of glass that he was using and how he was using it was unprecedented. Peonies in the wind, because of this, he gained an international reputation and contributed to the revival of it. Peonies Blowing in the Wind was a part of a series of at least 7 that Lafarge created between 1880 and 1909. All of them are based on the themes of peonies and adapted from Chinese and Japanese hand scrolls and porcelains. The museum's window is possibly the one that was exhibited in the 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle, where Lafarge was awarded the Legion of Honor medal for his invention. They call it the invention of opalescent glass. While his work was on view at the Paris exhibition of 1889, the exhibition jury said he created in all its details an artwork unknown before. So for his audience, he was really showing them something that they could not recall, that was just mind-blowing for them. So he was the first designer to use this opalescent glass, which ends up being a uniquely American phenomenon. That features this milky, opaque, and sometimes rainbow-hued appearance with the introduction of light. The Peony's window is an excellent example of this technique and expertise in his ability to paint with glass. It has stained glass had been used for centuries in tableware, but it had never been formed into flat sheets for use in stained glass windows or other decorative objects. And for his early experiments, Lafarge had to custom order flat sheets from a Brooklyn glass manufacturer. His search was to create vibrantly colored stained glass windows, achieving the illusionistic effects of painting, but with a luminosity, a richness of color, and an animation unattainable with paint. So opalescent glass went on to become a hallmark of windows by Louis Comfort Tiffany, and other American stained glass manufacturers. Lafarge revolutionized the look of stained glass, which had remained virtually unchanged since the medieval times, when artisans utilized flat planes of white and colored glass with details painted on them before firing and leading. So these are Lafarge's patents that he applied for in 1879, shortly after a newspaper praised a window he had made as, quote, the first application of a new material to windows. He was granted a patent in 1880 for a, quote, colored glass window with technical details about manufacturing opalescent sheet glass and layering it to create windows. So the figure 1 here represents a window containing panels of his glass invention. This is a cross-section of what the glass looks like with the layers that he would fuse together. And then this is figure 3, a conventional colored glass, which would have been coated with a very thin layer. So you can see, and when you see the piece in the galleries and you look at it from the side, you can see the different layers and that it's has these really wonderful textural qualities that if you touched it, which I do not recommend, you would feel the difference and you kind of feel the raising bumps and the gullies within the glass. So 8 months later, after Lafarge filed a patent, Tiffany applied for a similar patent, which was granted in 1881. The chief difference between their patents, although I've looked at them both, they look nearly identical, is that Tiffany lists slightly different technical details. Lafarge's patent focused more on the material, and Tiffany's more on its use in construction. Because of the technicalities, it seemed that the two patents might be mutually dependent, prohibiting either artist from making the stained glass windows without the other's permission. Conundrum. It's possible that Lafarge may have come to an agreement with Tiffany on the use of Lafarge's patent, but the details are unclear and it's still disputed by scholars. What we do know is that around 1882, Lafarge planned to sue Tiffany, claiming that he had infringed Lafarge's patent by appropriating some of his working methods for opalescent sheet glass. Official records of the lawsuit were never found, suggesting it was never filed, but there are also references to it in correspondence between both men. So, however they were resolved, Lafarge went on to do amazing things, and of course, today, Louis Comfort Tiffany is most well known for opalescent glass. So before because I have to use the restroom, any questions that we have? Red shirt. Hi.
Any thought about illuminating the peony window from behind? Is there a reason why we don't?
It is illuminated from behind, actually. Oh, the question was, is there any indication about illuminating peonies from behind? It is illuminated from behind. However, it is not a very strong illumination. And that is something that was implemented prior to my time being here. I have had conversations with Jake Ludeman, who's our lighting designer, about ways that we can get it maybe a slightly more animated. But because it was built into the wall when the galleries were renovated in 2009, it's not an easy solution. So it is on my radar. That was your question? I know, it doesn't look illuminated, but it is, I promise. Like Claire Driscoll? Yes. So the question was, Louis Comfort Tiffany was well known, but had a very large workshop of women, and a lot of women were doing the physical work of making the glass as well as designing. And you may have heard of Claire Driscoll. She was one of the identified women who's been talked about quite a bit, and whether or not Lafarge was kind of utilizing the same thing. Lafarge was never to that level that he had a workshop in that way. If he did, because he was a painter and he was so close to that practice, and because he was never really making production, he did a lot of commissioned work, a lot of commissioned windows. He would compete for architectural commissions in public buildings. And so I think just the level of working was very, very different. And also that if you hear the name John Lafarge, you don't immediately have any of the same recollections that when you hear Louis Comfort Tiffany, you're immediately, dragonflies, I know exactly what's happening right now. This is, it just wasn't the same level. And so Lafarge was really doing a lot of his own work and did a lot of that investment. And so it's kind of heartbreaking when you think about about that. But he was definitely still incredibly prolific in the work that he did. He was showing at international fairs. He was kind of the catalyst for this opalescent glass and the way that it was kind of reintroduced. And then, of course, with the way that capitalism and society kind of works, Tiffany was also at the same time making some of those same discoveries, but employed it in a very different way for a very different client base. Yes.
So the difference between lead stained glass, which has been used in churches and things for centuries, and this, and more decorative glass, was the glass itself, was opalescent glass.
So the question is, what was the difference between the historic leaded glass in medieval churches and the glass that this is with the opalescence? So it's a combination of things. So one of them is in medieval glass. A lot of it was a single layer, and so even though you see the glass being colored, it's not solidly colored. It's not. If you kind of cut through a cross-section of it, it would have just had a very thin layer, almost what we would call a painted layer, of the red, of the blues, of the greens on top of it. So it's all one single plane that has a very thin layer on top of it, fused on top of it. Opalescent glass is a combination that makes this kind of iridescence in it, and it's multiple layers to create these very thick things. So I think about it as this kind of, not all opalescent glass has that kind of milky, creamy, opaqueness quality to it. So you would use layers to build that up within this. So it would have some of the similar bases, but is really a combination of the adding of the iridescence and the opalescence and the layering to make it significantly thicker and different layers.
And the layers were all the same color, or did they use different?
He used different colors. So I think that's also where the layers are not all the same colors. He was using different layers of different colors to create some of those things. So when you go and you look in these, you can see, particularly in some of the petals, he was combining colors to actually paint with this glass material. So that's where those kind of sweeping motions come in, and you see that very painterly quality of what looks like a brush stroke but is not a brush stroke because it's within the glass material itself. Yes.
Again, between the medieval glass and the more modern glass, the pigments, the materials, the colors of glass,
So in medieval glass, the question is, in medieval glass, how were the colors used to pigment? Sometimes they would have just actually painted colors. However, we know that if you go back to Egyptian times that you have the faience and the blue and the melting, and so they were using materials like that. However, the consistency and the availability of those things were very limited in production, and when we think about medieval glass, that it wasn't always efficient, and there wasn't always those materials available, so there would have been some form of painting and then a layer of glass on top of it to fuse that color in.
what
The question is, what were Tiffany and Lafarge using to color their glass? They were using it's not paint in the same way. And even when I say paint, historically, it's not, oil paint. They would have been using different colored pigments. They would have been using ochres, but they would have been mixing it with that kind of glass material. But because of the nature of glass and the heat, they would have had to find things that would withstand the heat and that wouldn't burn. And so finding materials like faience and other things. I don't know off the top of my head what each of the colors would have been used, but they were mixing it in a way that was kind of similar to painting. But I can find out some more. Always happy to research. Yes? Yes, the difference is the color is in the glass as opposed to on the glass or sandwiched between the glass. I do.
Just wanted to say, I have fallen into the role of the stained glass expert at the Second Presbyterian Church on the street. I'm sure you've seen it.
We are ready whenever you are. Well, thank you all for staying. I greatly appreciate it. The second half, we're going to go through the rest of the galleries. And I wanted to start off this portion by showing you some recent acquisitions of silver, which we do not have on view yet, but are hoping to have on view in the next 6 months or so. I'm not 100% sure where they will be going as we're starting conversations with Stefanie Knapp. I'm sure you know that our museum is unique in that we show our decorative arts objects integrated throughout, which I am a huge advocate for. I think it creates a much more fulfilling experience for our visitors, but many of our visitors who don't frequent other institutions maybe don't necessarily know that decorative arts might normally be relegated to their own space. So it's always something nice to point out that if they go to St. Louis, the decorative arts are in their own gallery, which happens to be in the basement, which I do take offense to. So because of that, it means that anytime we put something on view, I have the pleasure of working with my colleagues. So we're in conversations with Stefanie Knapp, but we recently purchased these pieces. So we now have Tiffany & Co. in the collection. Yay! So Tiffany & Co. became the foremost American silver and jewelry company during the second half of the 19th century. It was actually founded in 1837 by Charles Louis Tiffany, not to be confused with Louis Comfort Tiffany. I know there's a lot of Tiffany in my field, I'm sorry. Different. It was founded by Charles Louis Tiffany and John B. Young in Brooklyn, Connecticut, and it was originally a stationery and fancy goods emporium. And by 1853, it was under the sole leadership of Charles Tiffany, and at that time, the company began to focus exclusively on the manufacture of silver and jewelry. So Tiffany silver was readily available, originally to customers of all economic levels. The items Tiffany & Co. produced ranged from large presentation cups and trays to silver flatware services. They had over 350 different types of implements in a wide variety of patterns. And not only did Tiffany use mail order catalogs, they used local retailers, print advertising to publicize the wares. He also employed visibility and gained renown at world's fairs and international exhibitions to promote sales. It's very, very smart. So the designer of these spoons, Charles Grosjean, was extremely well known for creating two of Tiffany's most distinctive flatware patterns: the Japanese-inspired lap over edge and chrysanthemum, and both of them were designed in 1880. Chrysanthemum, you can still go on Tiffany & Co.'s website and purchase them today. Given the complexity of the pattern, it was not these patterns, but our spoon patterns. It was not put into production, and it was only put into limited production until a few years later. And actually, the newspaper publisher, William Randolph Hearst, ordered a large service of about 300 pieces in the 1890s. So like so many of his design colleagues at Tiffany, Grosjean looked to a wide variety of design sources for inspiration. For these spoons and the rest of the service, he studied George Catlin's Illustrations of North American Indians, which was first published in 1841. Catlin traveled to native lands in 5 trips between 1831 and 1837, documenting or inspired by native peoples and the cultures he saw. His illustrations were published numerous times and served as the source for many non-native depictions of native peoples. We have a painting by Catlin on view in our galleries right now, and that the Tiffany designers were looking to these various sources for their products was in keeping with the zeitgeist or character of the times. Journals were filled with essays and illustrations of other cultures and people. Travel was expensive and very difficult at this time. So, quote, armchair travelers could learn about other cultures through essays and illustrations. To be honest, it doesn't actually feel that far off from the internet today. You can Google and see images of anything. Maybe the internet's not quite as narrowed down as these journals would have been, but World's fairs were, of course, also a popular way to visit other cultures, and many of the fairs had areas where people, like objects, were on display. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, where the spoons were shown, was not without its pointed message for fairgoers, that Columbus had found the New World and civilized the land. According to a commentator, quote, the exposition contained both museum exhibits and outdoor living exhibits, in which native people from different parts of the Americas, as well as people from throughout the rest of the world, were displayed to fairgoers as objects as anthropological inquiry, as living specimens that illustrated the stages of development of mankind in the Americas. I think it's important to address, as we cannot and should not ignore history, and that these things happened and have contributed and perpetuated ways of thinking and repercussions which we're still dabbling with today. So the spoons illustrate a Euro-American adaptation and perspective of Native American motifs and imagery. And I think that that's important in the same way that this is not new. We were doing the same thing with Japanese and Chinese motifs, forms of exoticism throughout history. It's something that art and design has continually done. The spoons also exhibit American innovation, ingenuity, and expertise in the medium of silver in an international context, and represent American silver that won awards at international exhibitions. So they are really beautiful objects. As for the vase, Tiffany & Co. never really embraced the Art Nouveau period, or the Art Nouveau style. If you guys are familiar with Gorham silver, we do have some fabulous pieces of Gorham, which is another American manufacturer from Rhode Island. And they very much embraced the Art Nouveau, and we have something called a Martel service, and you can feel those kind of sweeps, and it was very in vogue. Tiffany actually, because he never embraced the Art Nouveau, lost quite a few customers and did not gain as much money at the time because of that. However, company's still in existence. They weathered the storm. They moved towards a more restrained and modern vocabulary, and this vase shows the firm's commitment to more classical forms. With its beautiful elongated handles, the minimal enamel decoration, it's really hard to see here, but there's this really beautiful, I think, blue enamel kind of throughout the handles that's kind of scattered up. And it foreshadows the classicism of the Art Deco of the 1920s and 30s. The designer of the vase is Paulding Farnham, and he trained under renowned Tiffany silversmith Edward C. Moore. And Moore was noted for his study of objects and styles from a wide range of historical periods and geographic locations. His vast collection was actually donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And that informed his designs for Tiffany jewelry and silver. And so Farnham, being learning from Moore was also in that same vein, and Farnham helped Tiffany win the grand prize in jewelry at the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle with his intricate and colorful gemstones and enamel brooches. So this would have been around that same time. And you also can see that there's some really beautiful red and yellow designs, and then the green floral. So I'm very excited for when we get to put it on view. Moving on to the next gallery, I want to discuss this desk by Charles Rolfs, which pairs really beautifully with this painting by Pido. Both artists were somewhat obscure in their given field. They were largely self-taught and were forgotten for a time and then rediscovered well after their deaths. Books on a Table, which is the painting, presents this variety of objects associated with a gentleman's study. It's precariously balanced, and the arrangement suggests contemplation, and of course, laments the end of the 19th century as the quill pen and candle at that time were very antiquated. The turning pages also evoke the passage of time. So Pido was very well known for this kind of trompe-l'oeil effect. He painted a wide variety of still life subjects, letter racks holding printed material, shelves, tabletops, doors, etc. During his lifetime, only one major exhibition of his work was put on, and in 1889, he and his wife moved to New Jersey, where he built a house, and then went on to perform as a cornetist. And there, from then on out, he painted in semi-seclusion and obscurity there for the rest of his life. So Charles Rolfs pursued a career in acting, actually, he was an actor, and maintained contracts with various foundries, designing cast iron stoves. And during the 1890s, he began experimenting with cabinet work, promoting himself as a professional maker of artistic furniture, with his flair for the eccentric and refusal to be categorized of adhering to any particular style or school. International critics singled out his designs as among the most innovative and artistic produced in the United States. Around World War I, changing taste decreased sales and eventually prompted Rolfs to end his furniture designing activities, where he was largely unknown for many, many, many years, and it really wasn't until the 1980s that he was kind of sought out and found out, and a lot of scholarship happened. So if you're familiar with ceramics, he was kind of the George Orr of furniture, the way that George Orr is to ceramics. Recent research also shows that Rolf's early experiments with furniture design involved close collaboration between husband and wife. His wife was incredible. Diaries and letters reveal that Mr. Rolfs was especially lucky and happy in his marriage to Ms. Anna Catherine Green, who was a successful mystery novelist, popularizing the genre a decade before Arthur Conan Doyle brought out his first Sherlock Holmes story. She's been called the mother of the detective novel and was one of the first writers of detective fiction in America, distinguishing herself by writing well-plotted, legally accurate stories because she was the daughter and had brothers who were lawyers. Sorry. I'm all about strong women, very excited. In many ways, he and his wife were quintessentially modern in their lifestyle because she was the breadwinner of the family because of her writing, virtually their entire lives. So he was able to move from stove design to acting to artistic furniture design. She also helped her husband design furniture for their home initially because the couple couldn't find any pieces that they liked or what they were interested in having. So that was when they kind of decided to endeavor to make their own furniture. And then neighbors and guests asked Rolfs to make furniture for them as well, and then that hobby kind of became a business. So made of oak stained a matte brown, Rolfs's furniture is embellished primarily using elaborate carving. His unusually inventive forms and imaginative carving combine many influences, from abstract naturalism to Art Nouveau to the bold forms of the arts and crafts movement, although he denied any connection to any specific movement. He was very much aware of kind of creating his own niche. His inventive silhouettes and imaginative carving combined these different sources. His virtuistic carving recalled Chinese and Japanese forms and highly stylized renditions of nature. He claimed that his individual inspiration came from the natural grain of the oak and his creative imagination. There you have it. He claimed the visual thrill of Rolf's swirling patterns against the oak's pronounced grain creates this really fabulous intensity and drama, which is very alien to the seriousness of the arts and crafts furniture, which I'll talk about in just a second. In these pieces that strike the right balance, which I think that this desk is really fabulous. It's wonderfully exciting. It has this really turbulent energy that kind of borders on frenzy. When you look at everything that's happening, you have this kind of like fire smoke swirling up at the top, these kind of organic, kind of lace-like forms on the side, the fabulous cutouts, and then each of the 4 drawers that opens up out of the side. It's just very imaginative. The frets on profiles and then these groves of the carved ornament. While acceptance of his work never enabled him to transition from a personal workshop to a small factory, he did sell enough of his 2 most famous early designs to begin hiring assistants in 1900. One of those 2 very famous early designs was a rotating desk, like our own, resting upon a base that allows the upper portion to pivot. This is actually a base, and if you have seen or maybe witnessed a visitor reaching for the cabinet, you know that it swivels. The swinging writing desk has cutwork details, pronounced pegs, and the wispy smoke-like finials, suggesting almost a kind of a storybook chalet. I think very much about Hansel and Gretel when I see this cabinet. The dark finish and pierced cutouts create this fanciful medieval quality, so it doesn't really feel like from the time that it is. It doesn't feel in the kind of turn of the 20th century. He designed the piece for maximum functionality with a drop front writing surface, so this peg comes out and it drops down, propping up on here. A book stand, drawers, and shelves. And in an 1899 article for The House Beautiful, Charlotte Moffat described a similar example as, quote, a very marvel of complexity, with endless delights in the way of doors, pigeonholes, shelves, and drawers, and noted it as, quote, nothing so much as a miniature Swiss cottage. So as an industrial pattern maker for cast iron stoves, Rolfs had become really intimately familiar with the class divisions between craftsmen and designers. And he was really conscious about what side of the line he occupied and embraced the role of auteur as an industrial designer and an actor. As a furniture maker, he was not wedded to the process of craftsmanship, although he was devoted to wood as material. So for him, it wasn't necessarily about creating these really high handcrafted pieces. It was about the artistic originality and his individual expression as a designer and a maker. Through this shift in emphasis, Rolfs had a handful of his contemporaries in this and other mediums quietly, almost inadvertently, invented this new vocation, kind of the studio crafts kind of developed out of these, he and his contemporaries. However, even at the height of his success, Charles Rolfs never employed more than 8 woodworkers or wood carvers in his Buffalo, New York workshop. And as mass-produced furniture became readily available and styles changed, Rolf's eccentric ideas didn't really attract enough of a following to sustain the business, and he all but abandoned cabinetry and became active in civic affairs later in his life and just completely ceased making things entirely. So a really great counterpoint is to look at the 2 different pieces of furniture that are in this gallery. They're both associated with the arts and crafts movement, and you can appreciate their differences as handcrafted, unique furniture objects. Though obliquely associated with the American arts and crafts movement by nature of his independent studio and interest in the social benefits of his work, Rolfs really avoided these what we would consider kind of rigid lines and what was called, quote, honest joinery, end quote, of his contemporaries like Gustav Stickley. He was in favor, of course, of these kind of fanciful forms and undulating curves, and this particular delicacy of the pierce work, which deny this comparison to most furniture of the period. So although he is a part of that movement, he's definitely an outlier in that sense. Whereas Stickley, on the other hand, became one of the major American figures of the arts and crafts movement. This is kind of quintessential when we talk about American arts and crafts furniture. The arts and crafts movement emerged during the late Victorian period in England. And at that time, it was the most industrialized country in the world. Anxieties about industrial life fueled a revaluation of hand craftsmanship and pre-capitalist forms of culture and society. Designers sought to improve standards of design, which they believed were corrupted by mechanization. Their goal was to create environments in which beauty and fine quality prevailed. Doesn't that sound lovely? The arts and crafts movement advocated reform as a part of its philosophy and investigated a critique of industrial labor as modern machines replaced workers and called for an end of the division of labor. It, of course, obtained its philosophical underpinnings from two important sources. The first, the designer Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, whose early writings promoted the Gothic revival and foretold English apprehension about industrialization. One of his clocks is on view in our block galleries. You may have heard me talk about it at the reopening. And it was one that was designed for Parliament. So in the very early British gallery, the clock's next to the beautiful purple chair. The second was theorist and art critic John Ruskin, who advocated medieval architecture as a model for honest craftsmanship and quality materials. Ruskin was a fierce critic of Britain's factory system. He spoke out against inferior quality of products, of that machine-made goods were terrible. He attacked the aesthetics of them, and basically said that they were stripping things down to purely function and that beauty was lost. In Ruskin's view, mass production enslaved workers to machines and robbed them of the pleasure of their labor. To right these wrongs, he advocated a return to what he saw as the superior practices of the medieval crafts guild. As a result, William Morris, whom you may have heard of, strove to unite all of the arts within the decoration of the home, emphasizing nature, simplicity of form, and he founded Morris & Company, which produced well-designed and largely hand-wrought textiles, wallpapers, stained glass, and furniture. Stickley, of course, adopted the social and artistic principles of the arts and crafts movement, and in 1900 introduced a line of artistic new furniture characterized by sturdy materials, rectilinear forms, sparse ornamentation, and evidence of honest construction. His handsome, carefully constructed craftsman furniture, metalwork, and textiles were targeted at America's burgeoning middle class and successfully sold and were very widely imitated, even by his own brothers. His influential Craftsman magazine became a leading national advocate of the movement's ideals. In our writing table, the form itself has this arched apron and supports with these 4 straight legs, the sled base, and it is joined by a central stretcher. These elements are emblematic of Craftsman line of furniture produced by Stickley around 1903. The inlay that you see here, and it's also on the other side, was designed by Harvey Ellis, who worked at times with Stickley. And it adds this really beautiful and elegant lightness to this very kind of straightforward and robust design of this desk. Ellis's delicate inlaid motifs are pewter and copper, and they recall the designs of Glasgow's designers such as architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And they're actually Viking ships. Inlaid on the pewter medallions are Ellis's creation, but are apropos of the broader romanticism of the early 1900s. The excavation of Viking burial sites garnered intellectual and public interest at the time and saw a resurgence of interest in Norse cultures, resulting in the Viking revival. Elaborately detailed pieces such as this table are rare, as they prove to be too complex and too costly to put into full-scale production for the middle class. their intended consumers. Stickley's arts and craft furniture expressed his unique design sense, his mastery of form, proportion, and color. It was good citizens' furniture, simple, functional, and sturdy. And its decorative effect depended largely on the honestly revealed structure. So when we go back to honest construction, and what I'm saying and what the designers were thinking about is that you could see these tenon joints, you could see how it was made, and that a lot of the pieces, you don't see any fasteners, you don't see any nails or screws, because they were very limited in use. They were joining these pieces together through kind of lap or tenon joints. And so you were using wood to connect with wood to create good and sturdy pieces of furniture, as opposed to taking two boards, smacking them together and hammering them, which was kind of the dig at modern industry and production and cheap labor. The emphasis on the details of joinery, tenon and key joints, exposed tenons, visible dowels, they're all things that celebrated the handmade nature of Stickley's furniture while de-emphasizing the machine process used in its construction. Stickley's furniture gave the appearance of being handmade in the best of the arts and crafts tradition. But in reality, it benefited from the efficiencies of its well-equipped factory. By 1899, Stickley Company was listed as having 154 workers, one of the largest furniture companies which was produced in New York State. This is the factory, this is a shot on the inside of the factory, and this is an image of all of the workers outside around, I think, 1900. Stickley's apparent duality, the gulf between what he said and what he did, reflected what were very lofty and very radical goals. The British arts and crafts movement that inspired him, as well as some of the movements of American incarnations, often had an elitist caste. Artfully designed, handcrafted goods were affordable only to the very, very, very wealthy. Robert Morris himself was incredibly privileged in his status and in his security, financial security. And it was a conundrum that he dealt with because he had the privilege and the luxury of being a through and through socialist, believing that if we all just worked together and loved what we did, we'd be okay. And Morris sold his products to the rich because he was never really able to solve the problem of merging handcrafted goods and the cost of handcrafted labor with a middle class or a lower middle class. So Stickley took these values of the arts and crafts seriously, and to them he added this creative, expansive vision and his dynamic entrepreneurial views. So he sought to make the movement more inclusive and its products available to a wider public, and the way to do that was through the use of mechanization. So everything was still being crafted by an individual, but with the use of mechanized products. And so he did this with great success. I want to point out that the styles and technologies that I'm discussing can also be applied to these two works. The fabulous Tiffany lamp and the bookcase by Green & Green from the Blacker House. They both align with the principles of the arts and crafts movement. You also know a little bit more about stained glass now as well. And they both have Chinese and Japanese influences were contributing to both of these designers in the way that they were thinking about things, and I think you can really see that. Green & Green, if you go and you take a closer look, you can see those kind of tenon and joints, that honest joinery is reflected in those pieces, and you can also see the Japanese influence in both of the works, particularly the Japanese influence. I also wanted to point out the elevator alcove, one of the pieces, because I know you may or may not spend some time there waiting for an elevator with any number of your groups. This is a piece by William Hunt Dietrich, and although he was influenced by the American vernacular weather vanes of the 18th and 19th century, Dietrich gave them a contemporary twist with his choice of subject matter and his adaptation of a style that embraced really contemporary art and design. At this time, it's very Art Deco. His articulation of the Art Deco style derived from European art moderne models that reflected an interest in classical subjects or subjects rendered classically, and employed a decorative vocabulary expressed through abstraction and geometry. He is admired for his fluidity of line and the tremendous vitality and its marriage of early American crafts techniques, and then the abstraction of the Art Deco style of speed and progress. Dietrich's figures usually seem to be in motion, as you see here, and many of his compositions appear to document moments from the American jazz age and from this kind of Art Deco progress. Live fast and get in a fast car. So Dietrich was born in Austria-Hungary to a cultivated American and Hungarian family. He grew up in Switzerland. He then moved to the Southwest, mainly Arizona and New Mexico, and studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He traveled to Spain with the American sculptor Paul Manship, so he's very well traveled, has been around, has seen a lot of things. And as a sculptor, he was not interested in defining himself in any one material or vocabulary. He was really interested in working and experimenting with other materials outside of bronze or marble. He was particularly interested in working with iron and fabricated many candlesticks, andirons, window grills, fire screens, and weather vanes, employing both sheet and wrought iron. And although he produced a great number of cast works in bronze, the majority of his pieces were hand-hammered iron and forged by the artist himself. So his iron sculptures have this dynamism that exploits sheet metal's tensile strength, combined with the elegance of wrought iron supports. His work rejected naturalism in favor of strong graphic qualities that elevated unusual, although often refined, subjects to new levels. So he was famous for things like cowboys, greyhounds, bullfighters, and here we have polo players. They became iconic images and something that you wouldn't necessarily see in other forms of art. And he encapsulated the diversity of the early 20th century American experience. So he was really interested in kind of capturing these things that he thought were quintessentially American experiences and kind of putting them in this really new and dynamic Art Deco mode. The vitality of his comparisons can be seen in our polo weather vane. It captures movement and grace with silhouettes that leap from the arrow perches. The dynamic interplay of the riders and the horses and the mallets perform with that negative positive space, so it's shown off of the wall, so you have that shadow behind it so you can really see the movement and imagine that when it would have been on top of a building, you would have really felt that all of those, you would have really seen the light coming through it and shadows, and you would have felt like it was moving on top of a house. The energy of the horses is expressed not only with their charging legs, but in their gaping mouths and their eyes, while the players remain faceless. So taking a step forward in time, Frank Lloyd Wright was interested in and influenced by Asian design and culture, as well as honest construction. Wright devoted his life to promoting architecture as the great mother art, behind which all others are definitely, distinctly, and inevitably related. Wright pursued a consistent expression of underlying unity. He drew inspiration from the Japanese culture and ideas, and above all else, Wright's vision served beauty. He believed that everyone had a right to live a life in a beautiful environment, and he worked to create affordable architecture. We can debate affordable all day long. Frank Lloyd Wright's chair for the Sondern House is an example of a bigger cultural shift and the idea of home. Responding to the financial crisis of 1929 and the Great Depression, Wright began working on affordable housing, which developed into the Usonian home. The term Usonian means of the United States, and was used by Wright to emphasize his architecture as uniquely American, and specifically referenced the American Midwest. So he's talking about the Midwest landscape, the expansive plains. The style was Wright's solution to people moving outside of cities and the rise of suburbia, his answer to what he deemed the small house problem. A direct response to these post-war needs, the growing necessities of affordable, low-cost, and comfortable housing for expanding families and the baby boom. They were streamlined approaches to residential construction and offered an attempt of a simplified but beautiful environment for living. Wright would continue to design Usonian houses for the rest of his career, with variations reflecting diverse client budgets. I would say that although they attempted to be affordable, it's relative. Like Wright's houses were significantly, like Wright, his houses were significantly more expensive than others were at the time and required and continue to require much more maintenance. However, he did have a sliding scale, so depending upon your income, he would only charge you a certain percentage of your income to build a house for you in the Usonian home. Architecture for Wright was not just about buildings, but also about nourishing the lives of those within them. Wright's distinguished design principles include a connection to landscape, a strong horizontal emphasis created by dynamic roof projections, and the interplay between interior and exterior spaces. And the principles are also reflected in our block building designed by Stephen Hall. If you go down the walkway, you can make a little comparison between Wright and Hall. I think both of them would appreciate it. Wright stated that in organic architecture, then, it is quite impossible to consider the building as one thing. Its furniture is another, and its setting and environment still another. The spirit in which these buildings are conceived sees all these things together as one thing. To that end, Wright designed furniture, rugs, fabrics, art glass, lighting, dinnerware, graphic arts, all to be included in his buildings. Here you see an earlier Wright chair from the Francis W. Little House in Peoria, Illinois, as an early example of prairie school architecture, which derived from the arts and crafts movement and dates from 1902, so contemporary to the Stickley. The reclining armchair shares affinities with the movement and was made with a much more expensive material, oak. It's also dealing with the concept of westward expansion and American identity. Whereas the Sondern chair has the cleaner lines, uses geometric shapes, and is made of plywood, a much less expensive material. It was also, it's an extension of the chair and addressed the updated need of the American home, especially efficiency, modernity, and affordability. Plywood was introduced into the United States in 1865, and industrial production started shortly after. In 1928 was actually the first standard 4x8 foot plywood sheet when they were introduced as a general building material. And it was from these that Wright was inspired to create furnishings like the Sondern chair, which is a simple combination of horizontal and vertical planes. And this meant that construction only used a saw, a few chairs, a few nails and screws. And so he's really thinking about, if I have a 4x8 foot piece of plywood, how can I use that in the most efficient, effective way to be as cost efficient and as time efficient as possible, while still making a beautiful surrounding. This meant there was no need for expensive cabinet makers, and it was probably part of the living area in the home. The blue upholstery is not original. However, it's likely that it was reupholstered while it was still in use at the home. At this point also, affordability was a result of semi-standardizing designs, new technologies, and inexpensive material. Wright's use of innovative materials and technology was not new. He had been a long-time proponent of experimenting with virtually any new material that came his way, hence falling water and concrete. This was because he could then claim that he was the first architect ever to have employed it. So it was very self-serving, but also very forward-thinking at the time. Clarence Sonderen hired Frank Lloyd Wright to create his homes and furnishings here in Kansas City. It still stands near Roanoke Park on Bellevue. Sonderen was a middle-class, white-collar worker. He was actually a laboratory director for local chemists. The house was designed in 1939 and constructed in 1940. The original construction, please note, the original construction was just over 900 square feet. And cost savings were achieved by replacing a traditional excavated basement with a concrete slab. And rather than time and material consuming stud construction, the walls were constructed with plywood faces of a board and batten siding. So this is a type of paneling that was inexpensive and easy to assemble. So you would kind of get the board and the batten and fit one right into another and fit one right into another. Think of modern day flooring when you fit one board into another, but on your walls. It was easy to assemble, and therefore it was typically used for structures such as barns and garden sheds. It has alternating wide boards and narrow wooden strips called battens. The second owner of the home, Arnold Adler, hired Wright in 1948 to design an addition to the house, which included a new entry, additional carports, a large dining room, and a living area with a fireplace. An extra bedroom and baths were also added, bringing the house to a total of 2,916 square feet. He altered the original L shape of the house, which was a standard in Usonian homes, into a T-shaped structure with more than 100 examples built in the US. Usonian homes and their integrated furnishings revolutionized American design by providing affordable avant-garde design. I'm gonna end super early, sorry. I have gone through quite a bit of information today, thinking back to the Hooper Room and the mimicking of English style, taste, and products. We've shifted into an entirely new middle-class, affordable home. We have seen how time, style, and change have helped define and redefine American style, and we've come full circle. I think that these two works are really great ways to look at the early European influence on American decorative arts through the industrial age with a substantial shift in industry and stylistic preferences. From these works, we can access rich histories, including ownership, class and status, materials and technology, and the change in style and ideas of the time. We can see how these ideas are reflected today, whether they are challenged or perpetuated. And both of these works employ the ideals and styles of their distinct periods and demonstrate the massive changes that took place in this country as it's seen throughout our American galleries. So thank you guys so much. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I hope you have them. Yes?
The last time you mentioned the Frank Lloyd Wright 900 square foot one, the batten walls you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
were these the exterior walls to the house or the interior walls?
Both.
How sturdy would something like that be?
So, well, it's still standing, so it's pretty sturdy. He also used, Frank Lloyd Wright, the question was about the batten walls and how sturdy they were. It's something that was used in almost all of I'll call him Frank, he'd probably be offended, in all of Frank's Usonian homes. And a lot of the times he used cypress, which now is a very expensive wood, but at the time wasn't, and because there was a plethora of it. But it was something that didn't expand and contract. with heat and humidity, so it was very stable. And he was also thinking a lot about that combination with the brick that is also a staple of his homes. So in terms of construction, I have seen some construction documents for Frank Lloyd Wright homes. They do require a lot of maintenance. They do require walls to be, particularly exterior walls, more famously his roofs, to be replaced because of the flat. But they're definitely something that he was able to find a way, or I should say, his engineers were able to find a way to construct them in such a way that they were stable and incredibly efficient. Most of the Usonian homes also had radiating floor heat, which came up through pipes that ran underneath the floors, and so you aren't talking about a heating system in the walls, and so there wasn't kind of as much going on in his walls as what we think about modern construction.
And would this have been on a concrete slab?
All of the Frank Lloyd Wright homes were built on a concrete slab that was poured over the pipes, hence the radiant heating. Yes.
Question about acquisition. In the Rolf's desk, there's a label that says this was acquired by exchange of gifts. I've seen that a lot, but I don't know what that means.
So in our credit lines, it means that the decision was made to deaccession artworks that don't fit within the collecting priorities. Many of you may or may not know, there was not a designated decorative arts curator here until the 1980s. And so a lot of the things that were acquired prior to that were acquired by really fabulous curators, but that maybe didn't have the knowledge or the expertise in designated areas. And also, in terms of quality and the way that the museum has shifted, decisions were made to get rid of those objects, deaccession them. However, all deaccession funds per AAM and AAMD, the American Association of Museums, as well as the American Association of Museum Directors, as well as the Association of Art Museum Curators, designates that anything that is deaccessioned, any artwork that is deaccessioned and sold, funds can only be used for the acquisition of artworks. So if it was given and there are living descendants, we are required to notify them, obtain permission to deaccession that artwork, and then their credit line is transferred to the new work of art. And it's usually when we are interested in something that is of particular interest, that it is above a certain price range when we compile those. So I know that the Herder cabinet also has a ridiculously long credit line because of that. So that's what it is. Yes?
When you're placing decorative art, it seems to me that generally it's in the time period of the studio arts in that same gallery. Are there periods you can think of where maybe decorative arts have moved ahead or lagged behind the studio arts of that period? Where you would put decorative arts in a not a chronologically appropriate place, but a place that's more appropriate for its style or its style.
So the question is, decisions to install works in galleries are typically chronologically and of the period of the other works in the galleries, and are decorative arts ever shown in spaces where they're maybe ahead or behind their contemporaries? And I would say, yes, we actually, if you go through some of the spaces, actually in our block galleries, some of our decorative arts are anachronistic in time to some of those spaces, but stylistically make sense and are really connected. Because to be quite honest, many of the decorative arts were far ahead of their time, particularly once we get into World's Fair pieces, which is the bulk of a lot of our European galleries. Artists and designers were thinking incredibly competitively and innovatively in ways to create the newest and the best things. And tastes in your home tend to permeate more than kind of broader sweeping other artistic elements. And even today, when you look through magazines, it's still, I look through Dwell magazine, and what's dictating the taste in your home is the furniture, it's not the art on the wall. But they definitely worked in tandem with one another, and there are definite moments in time when I think that there's definitely that push and pull. And so you'll see that the dates of the decorative arts objects throughout many of the galleries, but I would say especially in Block, there's a little bit more kind of push and pull wiggle room, a little bit later than their contemporaries, or a little bit earlier than their contemporaries in any given space. If you guys don't have any more questions, then I don't know if you all know, but I just got back from maternity leave. So this is Alma LaRue. It's just one, but I had to get in her little devious smile. So this is Alma LaRue, and yeah, so I've been back for a month. So thank you all for putting up with my mom brain, and I hope that if you guys have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer questions. You can reach out to Marla as well, and we'll try and get as much information to you as possible. Thank you, guys.